My name is Brian Hamilton, and I'm a therapist associate at LifeSource Affordable Counseling. I'm also the host of the Real Victims of CPS livestream series on Facebook. I wanted to put this video together for the many parents who struggle with addiction recovery to give you a better sense of what can help you and what to avoid. So, addiction recovery, what I want to just say is that this is something that I am very passionate about. As I mentioned, I love working with clients who are struggling with addiction. I think it's an important population to work with because there is often a lot of shame and stigma that is attached to addiction recovery, and I enjoy providing space for individuals who are going through that to share their experiences. What I do not particularly like is how we treat addiction in this country or in the psychological community. As a result, this video is not going to be about DARE, mainly because the schools who implemented it saw a 29% increase in drug use. So, what I want to do is inform you about the recent science that's coming out about addiction recovery, what it is, why people develop addictive behaviors, and things to consider when seeking treatment. So first of all, what is substance use? Well, let's start with what it is not. It is not experimental or recreational use. In fact, people who use drugs or alcohol recreationally or experiment with substance use socially tend to have fewer symptoms of neuroticism than, say, people like me who have abstained from drug use entirely. So if you have used, don't think it means that there's anything wrong with you. That said, I also want to point out that not all drug use is equal. For example, to date, there has never been anyone who has ever died from too much marijuana use. There is, I will say, a troubling new trend where people who use marijuana regularly are getting admitted to hospitals for repeated vomiting, and that people have found they can control these symptoms temporarily with hot showers. If this is happening to you, please see a doctor, and you may also want to cut down on your marijuana use. I also want to say about marijuana that there is some evidence to suggest that teens who use regularly are at higher risk for schizophrenia, particularly if it runs in the family. There is also evidence that long-term weekly use can put you at higher risk for developing lung cancer. However, compared to other drugs, including nicotine and alcohol, it is much lower risk. LSD and psilocybin, the latter most often found in mushrooms, probably won't kill you, but they can have long-term hallucinatory side effects. Ketamine, or what's known as Special K, probably also won't kill you, but it is often used as a date rape drug, which obviously has its own long-term consequences for mental health. Heroin, meth, speed, and cocaine, on the other hand, can kill you just after one use. So be careful. If you're going to use, and I'm not advocating for drug use, but if you're going to use, maybe stick with the hallucinogens and stay away from the stimulants. That's kind of a general rule of thumb. So, substance abuse is a chronic condition where individuals experience cravings for the substance, wanting to cut down or stop but not being able to, taking the substance in larger amounts than that they should, neglecting other parts of their lives because of substance use, continuing to use even when it causes problems in their relationships, or using substances even when it puts them in danger. There are two primary models for understanding what addiction is. There is the moral model. This was the model that was originally put forward, which kind of suggests that it's due to a defect in moral character. That's why people use. The disease model, which is the most often accepted model in the mental health community, suggests that there is a biological or neurological disease that makes it more likely for people to use. Theoretically, in this country, we treat addiction as a disease. However, when you consider the fact that most substances are illegal and that people are often arrested, fined, and subjected to other punishments by the justice system as a result of their addictions, it kind of says that we haven't completely abandoned the moral model of addiction. So having said that, I want to show you this slide. This is based on a meme that I found on Facebook. And you might be saying that this is the disease model. But what I want you to kind of notice here is that it's almost suggesting here that addiction is an outcome or a symptom of deeper issues like poverty, loneliness, grief, and trauma. One might be saying that it has something to do with the moral model, but consider the fact that things like childhood trauma, grief, physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, while those are obviously immoral acts, it's not that the person did something wrong. It's that something was done wrong to the person that resulted in addiction. So just in this image, we're already starting to see that there's something wrong with the model that we have currently, both models that we have currently for describing what addiction is. So what's going on here? Well, this is where I would argue that substance abuse is actually not a disease, and it has nothing to do with moral failings. It's a coping mechanism. And I think we can even see that when we describe it as self-medication. It's a way to numb ourselves or to feel better temporarily so that we're not having to deal with the pain that we're feeling. To illustrate this, I want to encourage you to pause this video right now and check out this one by Freethink on what rats can teach us about addiction. There's a link in the description below. As you're watching it, I want you to think about what beliefs you currently hold about addiction, whether anything you see challenges those beliefs, and whether it affects the way that you might approach or treat someone who is struggling with addiction in the future. I'll wait. So, after watching that video, I'm hoping that you have taken away a few things. In particular, that environment and social isolation both play a huge role in addiction. If you're able to change your environment or your social situation, you may find that you no longer need to use the substance that you're currently addicted to. And finally, I want to just point out that the way we're treating drug use through shame, criminalization, and ostracization just doesn't work. In fact, it makes the problem worse. So, seeking help. You might think that the best place to go for seeking help is our good friend Google. I would say do not do this. Google is a great tool, but when it comes to addiction recovery, if you aren't sure what to look for, it can be hard to know what is a good resource and what is not. So for example, a lot of search results will pull up things like luxury rehab centers. While this looks like a great place to stay, and the premise behind them is that it gives people struggling with addiction a respite from their lives so that they can reflect on what their lives are and be free from difficulties. What it does is that when you return to your real life, your problems are still there waiting for you. And without a luxury pool or a room around, or a luxury hotel room around to give you some relief from these problems, you might decide to return to your drug use. The other thing is that a lot of addiction recovery centers will use questionable treatment methods like equine therapy. Even reputable treatment centers like Sierra Tucson will use these sorts of resources. While spending time with animals and horseback riding can obviously provide catharsis and activities that will take you away from your addiction, it is certainly not a cure-all. A lot of people struggling with addiction are horseback riders and may even have emotional support animals. There is also a lot of debate about whether things like equine therapy are used primarily to justify charging services like Medicaid and Medi-Cal exorbitant prices for those services. So the place you want to start is here on the American Board of Preventive Medicine's website. There's a QR code on the slide, and I'll also put a link in the description below. Put in your information here and search for a physician in your area who specializes in addiction recovery medicine. These individuals will not only be able to connect you with reputable addiction recovery services, they can also provide you with medical treatment options for controlling things such as cravings and withdrawal symptoms. So treatment options. The first option, obviously, is to do nothing. In fact, this is the method used by most people who are struggling with addiction. They don't seek any medical advice or treatment. They never go to a meeting. And yet, despite that, recovery rate is about 23%. About 1/4 of people will overcome their addictions by doing absolutely nothing other than abstaining from their use. Alcoholics Anonymous. This is the treatment method counts for 90% of addiction recovery centers in the United States. Even treatment methods like Smart Recovery and Kaiser's treatment programs are based on the 12 steps developed by Alcoholics Anonymous. If you are court ordered to undergo treatment recovery, this is the method the courts will order you to use. You would think that since it is accounting for 90% of treatment in this country, and that it has been it is ordered by the courts for drug treatment, that it would probably have a pretty high success rate in terms of recovery. But I'm afraid to say that it is actually only about 21 to 28%. And that's according to the best research out there. And it's basically saying that it is about 5% better than doing nothing at its best. But that's not the crazy-making part. Some of you may have noticed the other number on this slide, the 21%. And what that is that there are actually studies which have determined that enrolling in Alcoholics Anonymous program and doing that solely can be worse than doing nothing at all. And there are a lot of possible reasons for this. One is that the people leading 12-step programs often have no credentials other than having struggled with addiction themselves and finding the program helpful. Another is that meetings provide people struggling with addiction access to others who have connections to drugs and illicit substances that will allow them to continue their addiction. Another is that while AA proclaims that you need to submit to a higher power to recover, and they say that it can be any higher power, the writings and teachings are heavily based on Christian-centered religious philosophies. Even Judaism, the religion from which Christianity came, does not believe necessarily that God can remove all defects of character, as mentioned in the 6th step of recovery, nor does Islam. This is a very Christian belief. It is also very difficult for someone who is, say, atheist or LGBT+, to submit to a religious higher power when they often have difficulty accepting that such a higher power exists at all, and or have faced a lot of discrimination from people affiliated with religious organizations. And now that's not to say that religious beliefs can't have a profound impact on one's recovery, nor is it to say that people cannot benefit from AA. Some people can and obviously do. However, I want you to stop and consider, if any practitioner or any other area of healthcare stated that you need to have faith in a higher power to get better, and the reason that you're not getting better is because you haven't fully submitted to that power, how would you feel about that? How long do you think they would be allowed to continue practicing medicine before they found themselves before a medical ethics committee hearing? My guess is it probably wouldn't be very long. So cognitive behavioral therapy. This treatment method is the most heavily researched mental health treatment method in psychology. It's been used to treat everything from depression to schizophrenia, often in combination with medications that can help reduce symptoms. What would you think the recovery rate is for someone enrolled in a CBT-based program? Well, it's 60%. A little over half of people who struggle with addiction recover using CBT. So we're finally starting to see something that is successful in treating addiction, that is much more successful than doing nothing at all. Naltrexone. This is a generic medication that has been used in studies to control alcohol cravings. There's a story that one client whose therapist recommended naltrexone called up his therapist afterwards and told him that after taking the medication, he bought a 12-pack and had a couple of beers. His therapist is like, "Oh, I'm really sorry to hear that." And he says, "No, you don't understand. I had a couple of beers. Normally, I would have consumed the whole 12-pack. So what do you think that the recovery rate is with using naltrexone, particularly when you consider the fact that it's only used in about 1% of addiction recovery cases. It's 80%. 80% of people who use naltrexone to control their cravings develop a healthy relationship with alcohol. And yet, despite its success, it is still only prescribed in only about 1% of addiction recovery cases. So what accounts for this? Part of it is that naltrexone is a generic drug. It's no longer patented. And as a result, there are no drug manufacturers out there marketing it for use in addiction recovery. Another issue is the stigma of medication. A lot of people who are struggling with mental health are resistant to using medication to control their symptoms for a variety of reasons, including concerns about efficacy. But one of the biggest reasons it's not used more is because many AA programs discourage members from using any kind of medication to control their symptoms. The argument is that it is simply replacing one addiction with another. And while this message is less prevalent in AA than it has been in the past, since there is very little monitoring of what is communicated in AA programs, it's still a message that continues to be promoted throughout the country. So I hope this presentation has given you some things to think about. Is addiction a disease? How do our thoughts about addiction shape the way we treat it? What would you do differently than you would have before if you or someone you love is struggling with addiction? And finally, I want to just close by saying if you or someone you love is struggling with addiction, please feel free to reach out. Even if you don't wind up working with me, I'm happy to sit down for a 20-minute consultation and provide you with resources to help you or others you know who are struggling with addiction find help.